Do you ever wonder how music works? For example, perhaps this has happened to you before. You're in a bad mood, you're sad, you've had a rough day, and then you start listening to a piece of happy music. Let's say it's Handel's Hallelujah chorus from the Messiah. And suddenly you yourself feel a little happier, you feel a little bit more upbeat, a little bit better. How does that happen? How is that possible that music can affect you that way? Or the converse. You hear a piece of music that is very sort of melancholic or sad, and you suddenly yourself are a little bit more predisposed to being thoughtful or to being more even sad. How does music work like that? And even more so, especially if you consider that what is music? Scientists might look at music and think it's just a matter of acoustics. It's about sounds and how they're produced in the physical world. But if that's all it is, how is it possible that music affects you that way? And to make it even more interesting, how is it possible that when I hear that piece of uplifting, happy music, that someone in Nigeria hears the same piece and has the same response, someone in China, someone in South America, so that music, which is produced in the physical world, has a very subjective, very personal effect on me, but also universally so across all peoples and times and cultures. It's a very strange thing about music. And actually, someone that had an answer as to how that is possible, how that works, is Hildegard von Bingen. Now, if you're not familiar with Hildegard von Bingen, as recently as 2012, Pope Benedict XVI named her a doctoress of the Church. And there are only, of all the saints, only 35 are doctors of the Church, and of those 35, only 4 women, Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Lisieux, and Hildegard von Bingen. And when Pope Benedict named her a doctoress of the Church, he said about her, she is perennially relevant and an authentic teacher of theology and a scholar of natural science and music. And it's actually those 3 things, theology, natural science, and music, that are kind of connected to one another in Hildegard's thought, and that kind of answer that question, how does music work the way it works? So I want to think about that for a little bit. First, if you're not familiar with Hildegard, I guess the question is, who was she, right? So Hildegard von Bingen was born a very long time ago in 1098, so in the 11th century. And she was born into a family of lower nobility in Germany, along the Rhine River, and she was the youngest of 10 children. And what was typical of the time, especially if you had a lot of children and they survived infancy, which was difficult at that time, you might, one of the younger children might be given over to a monastery, first of all for their education, and then possibly to discern a vocation. And that's what happened to Hildegard. When she was 8 years old, she was given over to a Benedictine monastery in Disibodenberg, the monastery there on the Rhine, and she entered into the cloister. And many years later, she actually became abbess of that cloister. And in her memoir, she talked about, even before she was in the monastery, she had visions. And the extraordinary thing about that is she didn't just have visions, she had audio visions. She heard. It wasn't just that she saw things, but she heard this music. And actually, Hildegard never really wanted to take credit for those compositions because she felt they were dictated to her in a way. She heard this music. She was kind of scared of them. She wasn't sure what they meant, and they often accompanied moments of sickness or malady. But around the time she was about 42 years old, she had a very strong vision, and in this vision, she had a command. And the command was that she had to write down everything that she saw and everything she experienced for posterity's sake. And so she went about doing this with the aid of a monk in the neighboring monastery, and they wrote it down in a very large volume, which she called the Scivias Domini, Know the Ways of the Lord. Very thick book that contains all of her visions. And in this work, she details everything she saw and everything she experienced. It's divided into 3 parts. And the first part deals with her first vision, which is a vision of the entire order of the universe, the entire cosmos of the universe, even the shape of the known universe, which she famously described as looking like an egg. And this universe, how it is organized, what you might call the macrocosmos, right? So the planets, the stars, the heavens, nature, and earth. It also, in that vision, she is looking at, or she sees, I should say, God's relationship to man, and also the body's relationship to the spirit. So here we're getting closer to that question about music, how it can be both corporeal and spiritual in a way, right? And she looks at that and all of creation and God's relationship to that creation. And then she also sees at the end of this vision the fall of man, Adam and Eve, and original sin. And that's the first part. That's the first part of the Scivias. The second part of the Scivias, she sees what you might call the microcosm. So this is the universe that is related to us, in particular, the story of salvation. So in that vision, in part 2, she sees the first part was the order of creation. Now we're seeing the order of redemption. And she sees in that vision, of course, Christ. She sees Christ on the cross. She sees the Eucharist. She sees the church as the bride of Christ, and the church as the mother of the faithful. And she sees, in particular, the struggle against evil, good and evil, fighting with one another. So first vision is the macrocosmos, the universe, and its order. The second is our own particular place in that order and that spiritual part. Now, the third part is very interesting because there she has a vision that sort of recapitulates the second part, the story of redemption, but she ends it with something that she calls the Symphony of Heaven. And these are basically songs. They are texts to songs and music that goes along with it. And this is the beginning of her musical compositions. And this seems to be a funny thing to put at the end of this big work about the visions, but it becomes very clear that the music actually is intrinsically connected to the visions. So it's such that Hildegard, when she has this vision, she sees the larger universe and she sees our place in it. And she actually sees music as a way of connecting the two. And this connection is extraordinarily interesting because Hildegard doesn't just see these things, she hears them. She actually hears music in the visions. And so we can really talk about it, instead of being a vision, it's more of an audio vision. And she sees the order of, it's not just that she sees the order of the universe, rather she experiences the order of the universe as a sound. It's the central tone of creation is music, and it gives a sense of the order and harmony of the universe. And the reason she calls it a symphony is because she believes that when we have the music that reverberates throughout the cosmos, this harmony in God's creation, it's also in us. There's also a harmony in us, and that music is a way of sort of bridging those two things. And now we're getting very close to the answer to that question. How can music be created in the outside physical world and yet at the same time have an effect inside of us and universally so with all sorts of other people and other cultures? So it's this process of bringing our internal self in harmony with God and the harmony of His creation that she calls a symphonia. And of course, the symphony that we now know today is a particular genre of music, type of composition that you know through Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or Mozart's 40th Symphony. But there it was more generally the original Greek term, which meant this concordance of sound. And that's what is most important to Hildegard, because she sees the soul as symphonic. She even describes the soul as symphonic, meaning its architecture, if you will. The architecture of the soul is like a symphony. It has to be in accord with God's will and the harmony of God's creation. So this is the most important thing for her. So she sees her mission, as it were, in writing down these visions as a way of communicating to people what the experience of the holy is and what it could possibly mean to be in accord with God's will and God's universe and everything that is around us. And she never separates these two realms. She never separates creation from the soul and the spirit.